I've been using markers for years and I thought I knew everything about them, but I was wrong. Wow, this doesn't look like markers. I never expected that markers could create realistic portraits like what I'm about to show you.
You're literally sketching with the pen. That's not something I expected.
This has challenged everything I thought I knew.
I'm gonna start an argument. The colorless blender is not for blending.
And in the process of trying to do this for myself, I feel like I've discovered a whole new way to create with both alcohol and water-based markers.
What do you think is the biggest misconception that people have about markers?
This is Kat. She creates amazing realistic portraits that look like something you'd typically only be able to achieve with digital art. But she creates these by hand with markers. She's been a finalist or a winner for the past few years of the official Copic Awards, including placing second worldwide in 2022 for her amazing marker piece called From Within that uses an anaglyph effect to show what it's like to have an autoimmune disorder or an invisible illness.
Now there's a look. Well, this is migraine inducing when you've got the lights in the studio. This one just looks like a print.
Flip it.
It's clearly not a print. The level of realism is just something that I never thought you would be able to do with markers. The biggest thing that jumps out to me with all of this, you've created this beautiful realism and the lighting effects. And that's just not something I've ever seen anyone do with markers.
Thank you.
It's like it feels like digital art somehow, you know?
That's the thing I like about markers though. It's kind of like digital art and traditional art had a baby.
I love how vibrant these all are.
I've done a few pieces with just markers, but mostly I use them as an underpainting for my coloured pencils, which is a fun way to create art, but because all the blending and the details are done with the pencils, I've never really moved beyond the basics of creating art with markers. Even though at this point, I have a lot of markers to create with. So seeing what is possible is incredibly exciting, and it's motivated me to explore markers further and see if I can stretch my own skills and my understanding of this familiar but surprising medium. Now, Kat works with Copic, which are an alcohol-based marker, and there are so many alcohol markers in the market right now, all at different price points and different qualities. But alcohol markers aren't the only type of marker. There's also water-based markers, watercolor markers, paint markers, chalk markers, permanent fine line markers. And even within these categories, there are pigment-based markers, dye-based markers, and just a whole lot of variety that brings more questions than answers. My goal is to find out everything there is to know about markers.
Which are the best markers for beginners?
What on earth is a colours blender for? Do all markers bleed through the paper? Does paper really matter?
Can you blend water-based markers?
Which markers are the best for colouring books? I want to challenge everything we know, find the most surprising techniques, and uncover the secret powers of markers.
And the best way to do this is to try them all.
From all the types of markers available, the two biggest categories are water-based markers and alcohol markers. So today I'm focusing on these. Water-based markers are what most of us grow up with. Think Crayola, or if you're in Australia, those super fun connector pens. And then there's alcohol markers. These feel like the holy grail of markers when you first try them. They can blend, they're not streaky, and they're expensive. The main difference in alcohol versus water-based markers comes down to the solvent. Alcohol markers are a mix of dye and alcohol. The alcohol helps the dye particles to dissolve and spread evenly in the paper and dries really fast. Water-based markers are a mix of dye and water. They often leave streaks and are hard to blend, which is why most artists abandon them as soon as they discover alcohol markers. Water-based markers won't bleed through the paper like alcohol markers, but they will damage it. But that doesn't mean we should just write off water-based markers. And later in this video, I'll show you just how amazing they can be.
But first, I wanted to take a closer look at Kat's drawing process because I'd love to learn how to create the same kind of realism in my marker art.
This is a little like layer, I guess, infographic that I made. It's not the way you would traditionally be taught to do a marker artwork, but it's how I work. And it's sort of based on doing like color glazing that you would normally do with oils So I start out sketching in the lightest color possible. I find if you use like a pencil, then it tends to blend out into the color and kind of muddies it. And then I'm going to do everything, all the shading, everything in one color, potentially 2 colors.
Right.
So
This is interesting to me. Because my brain tells me that if you've coloured this whole thing in purple, how can you possibly then adjust the colour to something like this where I can't even really see much purple?
next one's just add your base tones, so flat colors over the top. You'll find, so you'll see here like a lot of the purples are disappearing. And then this section is all your final details. So I'm adding purple back in sections that it's kind of bleached out a little bit too much. I know it's using extra ink, which people really hate, but I like that because then you haven't make an informed decision on what you really want to concentrate on with your shadows as well. So
If I were to draw this, I'd be scared to keep going. I'd be like, no, this looks finished. This looks pretty.
Yeah.
Honestly, even just the monotone one, it's like, this looks pretty. But it's like when you take that risk and you keep going, it gets drastically better every time that you keep layering and adding more colors. And I think that is, again, that real painter mindset with this, where it's not just like color a section in one color. It's like you're thinking in layers. You're thinking how to create the undertones and then bring the skin color out. And I think that is just blowing my mind a little bit because that's not something that I would have thought to do with markers.
if I was starting out with an eye, I'm not going to be particularly...
You're literally sketching with the pen.
Yeah, because it's all going to disappear.
That's not something I expected. Your sketch was so quick and it looks really good.
I do this all the time.
No pressure, Sarah, no pressure. I am admittedly looking at it going, yeah,
Hold
okay.
it further back, hold it back here. Then
Oh,
you
I mean,
get
that's the same with pencils.
Yeah.
You get more of a flow if you're not holding it.
You're
This is-
stressed. This is stressed.
Yes. Bad. Well, not bad. This is like detail stuff,
Yes.
right?
That's later.
Holding it back for your loose stuff.
I hold it really far back. And I try to use like as little fingers as possible.
That's really good advice. And that's something that I try to show with pencils as well, of you start loose and you bring in closer when you come into the details.
All right, so what you're doing now is your darkest darks first, because they're the scary bits. So define where you're going to have really dark colours, and you're going to make them darker again later, so don't stress too much.
Okay.
But it helps because you kind of have to then make it work.
So far it is very monotone.
Yes.
That's what we're going for. What I do like about this approach that you're taking is it's kind of, you just keep building.
Yes. Yeah.
And that's something I like with pencils as well, is that if you can just figure out where a few shadows go and then do those.
Yeah.
And then you'll see, oh, hang on, I should probably put a shadow here as well. And that bit there, no, that's not as dark, but it does need a little bit of something. And you just slowly figure it out as you go. What do you think is the biggest misconception that people have about markers?
That they're difficult. I don't think people think of them as a fine art medium. They, get them from the shop and they go, oh, I'll just try it on my printer paper. And it's not gonna look anything like what it does on this paper. Or they put it on like watercolor paper, which is just gonna suck all of the ink out and it's not gonna move anywhere or blend. And then they sort of go, well, it's too hard, I'm done.
I thought I was doing my markers justice on normal paper, but I was wrong about this. So admittedly, I am totally guilty of using cheap paper with alcohol markers. The right paper matters more than anything, but there are almost as many different types of paper as there are art supplies to use on them.
The best paper for markers is completely different to the best paper for coloured pencils. And to make things even more confusing, the best paper for alcohol markers isn't the same as the best paper for water-based markers.
So by porous, you mean it will absorb whatever
Yes.
you put on it.
Yes.
So like a watercolor paper would be super porous.
Yes, exactly. So what you don't want to do is you don't want to have all of your ink just disappear into the paper. It needs to kind of sit on top a little bit to let you blend between colours, but you don't want it to be so, what's the opposite of porous? Anti-porous.
Anti-porous? Porous-less?
Yes. You don't want it to repel the ink entirely because that's not going to work
Which is
either.
actually what the Yupo paper does. So
Yes.
that would be the opposite.
That's why I'm scared of it.
Yupo paper is kind of one extreme.
Yes.
And
Like watercolour paper.
watercolor paper is the other extreme.
You want something in the middle. I think it needs to be quite smooth.
This is probably my personal biggest hold up with markers. I do so much detail with coloured pencils that I'll always choose a paper that works best for that. But if you're wanting to do more of your blending with the alcohol markers and really learn how to use them well, it's worth buying proper blending paper.
Printer paper is not ideal. I mean, you can make it work.
You can make it work, but you're working real hard for it. And if it's your first time trying markers, you don't know what you're aiming for and what they can do. And you see that and you see maybe something I've done online and go, well, why doesn't it look like that? I'm done.
Yeah.
On the other hand, absorbent papers are perfect for water-based markers, which don't work as well on marker blending paper.
The summary here is when you buy markers or pencils, try a few different types of paper before giving up on them. You are going to get very, very different results in different papers. You have to just try.
Yeah, and don't get frustrated straight away. I have been blending for a million years and am struggling on some of these. The good thing about doing layers like this too is you can start adding different colours in. You can add a little bit of blue somewhere, a little bit of green somewhere that maybe you wouldn't normally have if you were...
I love those hidden colours that you see in artwork. Yeah, that sounds really cool.
When you start doing like the pinks and the eyes and the nose, it brings it to life. So we've done all our base colours and now you're going to add all the details.
Well, I don't think I've ever played with markers like this.
Are you having fun?
I am.
Yay!
I really didn't expect such a cool result from my first attempt at using markers like this. This has inspired me to try another piece on my own and see what I can create. Hopefully I'll make Kat proud. I am in the zone on this piece and I'm excited to see where it goes. I'm feeling more confident with how these markers work together, but this wasn't always the case. In fact, one of the most common questions people have about markers is how do I make them blend?
The crucial question is, do you need a colourless blender to blend?
I'm going to start an argument here. If the colourless blender is not for blending, you can use it to blend to white, like to your background colour, but you don't need it for blending. The whole point of alcohol markers is they blend together on their own. You don't need an extra step, and this will actually bleach out your colour. So anytime you try and use it to blend, you'll get like these really patchy colours, and then that's when people go, oh, it doesn't work.
There are a lot of blending tutorials that swear by a specific process, but there are actually a bunch of different ways that you can blend your markers, so it's worth trying a few to decide which works best for you and for the markers you own. Let me show you a few using these two colours. First, here's a simple way to blend light to dark. For this, you'll start by colouring your object completely with your light colour. While it's still wet, choose your dark colour and draw the shadows. Then go back to your light colour and go over the area where you want the colours to blend together. You can then choose to go back to your dark colour to add deeper shadows or keep layering between the two to adjust the blend. Keep in mind, alcohol markers take a few seconds to really soak in and blend, so it's worth doing this slowly and not rushing to scrub your colours together. This method works best for shading with darker variations of the same colour, not for blending opposite colours. You can repeat the process and add more colours, remembering to go back to your mid or lighter colours to help with the blending. You can also start with your darkest colour first if you prefer. Start by applying your darkest colour, but don't colour the whole area you want dark because you can always add more later. While it's still wet, start colouring with your lighter colour over the darker colour and try to pull the dark colour with it as you colour into the area you want to blend into the lighter colour. This isn't as easy as going light to dark, but it uses less marker overall and might be a more useful technique for certain projects. The next technique is feather blending. Feathering is the first technique I ever learnt, but to be honest, I've never really liked it. It doesn't work well with juicier markers like Ohuhu, and it takes some practice to really get the technique right. So my go-to method is a bit of a mix of a few of these. When I'm wanting to mix two very different colours, I like to place them next to each other first and then layer the section in between, overlapping each colour slightly and using my marker to pull the main colours over each other. Sometimes I use lines and sometimes I'll use more of a circular motion. And here's a bonus technique. With alcohol markers, you can hold the tips against each other to transfer some colour from one marker to the other. And in this case, the juicier, the better. This means that the new colour will show up when you start drawing, but will slowly fade back to the original colour as it runs out. The same works with a colourless blender. You can either use the colourless blender to lighten your marker or use the marker to colour your colourless blender. You can even apply your colour to a paint palette first and pick it up with the colourless blender from there. This will stain the tip, but it won't damage it. And a quick wipe of your markers on paper after using them should clean them up back to their original colour. With all of these different options, the more similar the colours are, the easier they will be to blend. But with practice and the right technique, you can blend almost any colours together. But back to the colourless blender. What do you use it for? The colourless blender can be used to create textures, patterns, and to lighten areas of your art. It can dilute your colours, blend them to white, or even help erase some mistakes.
Rubbing alcohol is almost identical to colourless blender. It's cheaper.
I actually have a water brush that I just fill up with isopropyl alcohol.
Right.
Because
That's perfect.
it is its own colourless blender. Make your own.
Just finding things with textures on them and adding some of the blender on top and seeing what happens to your sort of undercolour. So let's say you were to sort of douse this. So if you just...
Play the desk all right.
Yeah.
Oh, that's clever.
And when I discovered this, I was like trying all of my clothes, and you can do things like make like a brick texture if you want.
It's kind of like an alcohol marker eraser. So instead of blending them, it's just erasing them.
So it's kind of blending them, but you're losing all your pigment as well.
I didn't know if I had enough Copic markers for the colour range that I might need for this. So I've used this opportunity to try out the new markers that Olo have just sent me. I'll be comparing these up against all my other alcohol markers in my next video, but my first impression is good. I like their range of colours and they're just the right amount of vibrant and juicy that I feel like I have a lot of control with a picture like this. I'm not sure if I would be able to blend like this with some of these other brands that have brighter colours and more moisture. And I know that this is one of the reasons why Kat still swears by Copic, even though there are some great alternatives available now. I'm really surprised at how much my process has changed with just 2 drawings since speaking with Kat. If you had shown me this piece a week ago, I wouldn't have known how to get here. This is why I love talking to so many different artists about the arts they love. I'm learning so much this year about how to be more creative and think about my art differently, from the drawing advice that I got from Jazza to my deep dive in mixed media a few weeks ago. Every time I find myself starting overwhelmed and I just jump in anyway. And every time I walk away with my new favorite thing that I've ever created. I feel like this is becoming a cliche that I'll end each video saying, this is the best thing I've ever drawn, because that's how I feel after each new thing that I'm trying. Which just shows sometimes you've just got to jump in and be fearlessly creative and just explore everything. Use up your good supplies, try something new, and don't worry about it being perfect. The best way to become a great artist is to just make lots of art. And I hope that in watching this, you're also excited to try something new, whether it's alcohol markers like this or something completely different. And as I am adding the final touches to this page, I want to thank Kat for sharing so much of her process. Please check out her YouTube channel and see some more of her amazing art on Instagram. I know I've already crammed a lot of information into this video, but this isn't supposed to be only about alcohol markers, because alcohol markers do have their downsides too. They are amazing at blending, they are water resistant, and they are just so fun to use. But they do have a learning curve, and they bleed through everything, even the best marker paper. So what's the alternative? So let's talk about water-based markers, and not just the ones you grew up with. Whoa, no, it's failing. That wasn't supposed to happen. There are so many options available now for high-quality water-based markers, and there's a lot of variety in the quality and the inks available, with some being even more expensive than the high end of alcohol markers. In the past, I've often used water-based markers instead of alcohol markers if I'm colouring in something that I don't want to bleed through to the other side, and if I'm intending to lay them with pencils. That way, the pencils can do all the hard work, because water-based markers can't blend. Or so I thought. It turns out I've not even come close to understanding just how good water-based markers can be. No matter what brand, the key is water. When you use water-based markers with water, you can create smoother blends, mix your own colors, have fun with different effects and techniques, and even turn the cheapest markers into watercolor inks.
What if you put water down first?
Whoa. It's time to explore the true power of water-based markers. Now, I'm not going to pretend to be an expert here because I'm exploring this for the first time, and I encourage you to do the same. Grab some markers and see what happens when you add water or change your paper, because it's a whole new creative adventure. To clarify, there are water-based markers and there are watercolor markers, and I'm talking about both. Even the Crayola Super Tips water-based markers can become watercolor markers with some of the techniques I'm about to show you. And to really put this to the test, I'm going to recreate the same image I just did with alcohol markers using water-based markers. I'm actually taking some of the technique that I learned from Kat with the alcohol markers and trying to apply it to these water-based markers, along with trying to remember back to the wonderful watercolor lesson I had with Scott Christian Sava when I first tried a watercolor portrait. I decided to start this page with the Zig Clean markers because I've heard so many good things about these, and frankly, I wasn't feeling confident going into this, so I wanted the best markers to make this easier. I love the vibrant colors of the Zig markers, but these brush tips, I feel like I'm cheating a little. They don't feel like markers, they feel like brushes, which is great. But I really wanted to experience this technique with markers. So I'm bringing in the Crayola Super Tips. And I have to say, given all the options available and all the more expensive markers that I could have chosen to use, I actually really enjoy the cheap Crayola Super Tips a lot. They are easy to use, they react beautifully with the water, and they aren't as streaky as many of their more expensive competitors. I was able to do a lot using mostly the Crayola, and I added a few Tombow dual brush pens to fill in some of the gaps in my color range. My one big complaint with Crayola is that their lids don't match the colors at all, and there are no color numbers or names on these, so I can't swatch them out on paper first. So I just end up testing them out again every time I want to use a color. Water-based markers are notoriously streaky and will damage the paper after just a few layers. But like with the alcohol markers, paper makes all the difference. If you're using even the best water-based markers on basic printer paper, it's like driving a Ferrari with the handbrake on. Even the worst performing water-based markers can create streak-free, colorful art if you choose the right paper. You can have bad markers, or you can have bad paper, but you can't have both. I've done some basic testing of some of the markers I've collected and found there was a lot of variety in how they performed on the printer paper. Many of them were streaky, they damaged the paper, and it was difficult to blend colors unless they were already very similar. When I moved to the watercolor paper, things started to work like magic. Even the simple Crayola Super Tips were blending beautifully between extreme colors and were able to create solid, vibrant colors. I also tried hot press watercolor paper, mixed media paper, and smooth Bristol, and found the cold press watercolor paper performed the best, which makes sense. It's intended to handle water. The others still worked with the right techniques, but were a little more difficult to use. When it comes to actually blending the markers, there are a few different ways you can do this. A lot of the techniques that I showed you for alcohol markers can kind of work for water-based markers too. They won't blend as easily because of how the color sits in the water, but it's worth experimenting. Adding water adds even more options. If you've got two colors next to each other, you can use water in the middle to pull the colors from each side and create a new color in the middle. You can also use water to pull a darker color across to a lighter color. But the best way to use water-based markers isn't to use them as markers at all. It's to turn them into watercolor inks. Grab a paint palette, a tile, or even a piece of plastic, then give it a scribble, and you've got yourself a watercolor palette. From here, you can use a water brush or a paintbrush and pick up the ink directly. You can even add water to dilute the color or mix multiple colors together. This is super handy if your set of markers doesn't have any lighter shades or if you're only working with a small set of colors. And it works for any water-based markers. They don't have to be the fancier markers that are specifically advertised as watercolor. You can also do a tip-to-tip technique with the water brush and the markers, although I'm not sure if this will damage your markers in the long run. But some brands even come with a colorless blender, similar to the colorless blender that alcohol markers use.
In theory, a colours blender in a water-based pen should just be water, right? So this isn't water, and I don't actually know what's in it, but it can be useful with some of these same techniques if water is too messy or unpredictable. But just like any new art supply, have fun and just experiment. Not all of these blending methods will work with all markers, and they won't all work on every type of paper. So spend some time getting to know your supplies, and you might even come up with some techniques of your own. If you're expecting water-based markers to blend as well as alcohol markers, then you'll probably be disappointed. Just like comparing watercolor painting to acrylic painting, water-based markers and alcohol markers work differently, so they need different techniques. But if you can lean into the strengths of each instead of fighting against them, you can create some amazing art and you might surprise yourself. Water-based markers usually don't bleed through paper, but they can damage paper easily if it's not designed to handle water, especially if you're doing more than 1 to 2 layers of colour. And let's face it, the biggest frustration most people have with water-based markers is they can be streaky. Instead of more layers helping the streakiness, it can often make it worse. So I've been playing around with a whole range of different markers and different paper, and I'm working on a sequel to this where I'll be putting over 100 different markers to the test, head to head, and testing every possible thing I can think of to see which brands are the best markers to buy for both alcohol and water-based markers. In the short testing I've already done, I was surprised at how many brands were actually pretty good with reducing streakiness. Some of the best ones weren't streaky at all. Even if you don't own one of these brands, paper makes a huge difference here. But there are some other techniques you can try to reduce the streakiness in your art and in your colouring pages. You might be tempted to slowly draw one line at a time, but allowing the marker to dry is the worst thing you can do if you're trying to avoid streaky lines. Ideally, you want to keep the marker wet for longer to allow each section to blend together instead of creating these sharp edges. I've personally found that the technique of quickly drawing back and forth is quite effective, but it does take practice to do this without doubling up on the layers. Adding extra layers in a different direction can be another way to reduce lines, but some markers will go darker or will start to damage the paper even with just 2 or 3 layers. You can try drawing in circles so that the overlapping areas are more like clouds than lines. Or you can try adding a very small amount of water or even blender marker to help the marker spread more evenly. None of these methods are perfect, and streaks in lighter colours will be easier to hide than darker colours, especially if you're trying to cover a larger area. And if all else fails, you can grab some pencils in a similar colour and lightly shade over the uneven areas. If you keep your pressure light, this should remove the lines instead of making new ones. I'd be lying if I said that this was all easy. Just a few days ago, I was unsure if I'd even be able to create a final piece for this video because I didn't feel like I learned anything conclusive from all the testing I've done so far. There's no doubt that alcohol markers are easier to blend with and layer with, but that doesn't mean that we should dismiss water-based markers altogether. When it comes to colouring books, water-based markers are a great choice. They won't bleed through the paper and they are quicker to use than pencils. As long as you're not colouring huge backgrounds, you should be able to work directly with the markers in most cases. And for backgrounds, maybe it's time to experiment with some water. You can stop alcohol markers bleeding through the pages by putting down a layer of gesso first. But in doing so, they will work quite differently and you might find them to be unpredictable. So just like everything else, just experiment and enjoy the process of discovering new ways to use the supplies you already have. If there's one thing I want you to take from this video, it's that there is so much more to explore in the world of art. You just have to jump in and be fearlessly creative. Don't worry about making a mess, don't worry about making mistakes. Just enjoy experimenting with different colors, different techniques, and even different paper. And even if you're feeling intimidated, just get something onto your page. Just start. Treat every piece as a learning opportunity and you might be surprised at what you can create.
Sarah?
More markers. There's a lot more to explore with these markers, and
I'm not done. I've already started testing all of these to find the best markers to buy. I'll be comparing their blending ability, their moisture, color range, price, their tip quality, find out do they bleed, are they streaky, and a whole lot more to find the best markers worth buying no matter what you're looking for. This next video is going to be a lot of work.